candles in the star chamber sputtered, casting long, macabre shadows across the mahogany paneling as the Duke of Ravenshire made his approach. The air was thick with the scent of hot wax and the copper tang of fear. Lucian's boots rang against the flagstones with the heavy, deliberate cadence of a funeral bell. To the gathered magistrates and the ravenous spectators in the gallery, he was the personification of the king's unyielding law, clad in navy velvet and armored in a cold, impenetrable dignity. At the room's center, Lady Evelina Marlowe stood bound. The hempen cords coiled around her delicate wrists like serpents, the coarse fibers fraying against her skin. She wore a gown of pale muslin, now tattered and stained, yet she carried herself with a quiet, humble anticipation that unnerved the assembly. She did not weep, she did not plead, she simply waited for the end of her world. Lucian reached the witness stand and unfurled the parchment. The heavy wax seal of the crown snapped under his thumb, a sound as sharp as a pistol shot in the stifling silence. "Lady Marlowe," he began, his voice a rich, sombre baritone that filled the hollows of the chamber. "By the authority vested in me as the sovereign's hand, I have come to witness the finality of your sentence. The High Court has deemed your hand responsible for the expiration of Lord Damien Whitmore. I am here to ensure that justice is served before the sun sets upon your life." He stepped forward to verify the identity of the condemned. It was a mere formality, a final look into the eyes of the Black Widow before the hooded man claimed her. As he reached out to tilt her chin upward, his gloved hand brushed the edge of her tattered shawl. The fabric slipped, cascading to the floor in a silent heap. The breath died in Lucian's throat. There, etched into the porcelain pallor of her throat, was the violet anchor, a gruesome, hand-shaped tapestry of bruises that froze the marrow in his bones. The marks were deep, mottled with the dark hues of a violent struggle, circling her neck in a clear, crushing grip. Just above her collarbone, a jagged indentation revealed the unmistakable heraldry of a signet ring, Damien's ring, pressed into her flesh with murderous intent. Lucian's hand, usually as steady as a mountain, began to tremble. The frozen realization shattered his rigid resolve like glass. He looked at the marks, then into Evelina's wide, haunting eyes, and the world tilted on its axis. He had come to execute a monster, but in the flickering candlelight, he found himself staring at the visceral proof of a martyr. The executioner had become the only soul in the Star Chamber who truly saw the victim. The silence that followed was a vacuum, profound and suffocating. Lucian's gaze remained transfixed upon the violet anchor, his mind a tempest of warring loyalties. The law he had served for 20 years demanded a signature and a death, but the evidence written in purple upon the lady's throat demanded a reckoning. "Your Grace," the voice of the Lord Chancellor cut through the gloom like a rusted blade. "The hourglass nears its end. We wait upon your hand to validate the crown's justice." Lucian did not move. His hand, still hovering near the grisly marks, curled into a trembling fist. He raised his head, his countenance transforming into a mask of flint and steel. "There shall be no execution this day," he declared, his voice a low thunder that reverberated through the rafters. A roar of indignation erupted from the gallery. "She is a murderess," a voice shrieked. "Give the Black Widow to the gallows." The king's advisers leaned over the balustrade, their faces mottled with shock and fury. "Duke Ravenshire, you trifle with the king's peace," the chancellor hissed, his eyes narrowed into slits of venom. "The verdict is absolute. To obstruct the law now is an act of rank sedition." "Then let it be called what you will," Lucian roared, his hand dropping to the hilt of his ceremonial sword with a resounding ring of steel. "I have presided over many a dark business, but I will not be the architect of a slaughter. Behold her neck. See the brand of the victim upon the throat of the accused. Is this the work of a cold-blooded assassin or the desperate struggle of a soul being snuffed out?" He stepped into the breach, his broad frame casting a shadow of navy velvet over Evelina, shielding her from the vitriol of the mob. "By the ancient prerogative of intercessio, I claim a 48-hour stay of execution. I shall take the prisoner into my personal custody at Ravenshire House for further inquisition. If her guilt remains unblemished after 2 sunsets, I shall deliver her to the headsman myself." "This is madness," an adviser cried. "The populace will have your head for this delay." "Let them come for it," Lucian replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy vibrato. He turned to the guards, his eyes flashing with a light that brooked no defiance. "Strike the bonds from her wrists. She is no longer a tenant of this dungeon. She is a guest of the Duke." As the hempen ropes fell away, Evelina let out a jagged, broken breath, the first sound to escape her lips. She looked at the man who had come to be her end, finding not a killer, but a protector. In that moment, the executioner had truly defied the world to save a ghost. The carriage journey to Ravenshire House had been a funereal affair, conducted in a silence so heavy it felt as though the very air had turned to lead. Now, within the subterranean reaches of the Duke's estate, the damp stone walls of the private hold seemed to exhale a cold, ancient breath. This was no common jail, yet the iron bars and the flickering torchlight cast a grim, sepulchral hue upon the proceedings. Lucian stood by the heavy oak door, his navy velvet coat discarded, his fine linen sleeves rolled to the forearms. He was a man possessed by a restless, gnawing agitation. Across the narrow cell, Lady Evelina sat upon a bench of rough-hewn timber. She remained as still as a marble effigy in a country church, her hands resting limply in her lap. Though the hempen bonds had been removed, the angry, red welts remained, a cruel embroidery upon her wrists that she did not seek to soothe. She merely watched the shadows dance, her expression one of quiet, humble anticipation, as if she were a traveler waiting for a coach that would never arrive. "I have staked my honor and my very standing with the Prince Regent upon these 48 hours, Lady Marlowe," Lucian stated, his voice echoing with a sombre resonance. "I have seen the violet anchor upon your throat. I know that Damien Whitmore was a man of dark and hidden appetites, but I cannot tilt at windmills with a phantom. I require your testimony." Evelina did not turn. The torchlight played across the mottled bruises on her neck, highlighting the jagged impression where the signet ring had sought to crush her windpipe. It was a silent, visceral confession of the horror she had endured, yet her lips remained sealed as if by a sacred vow. "The magistrates claim you were a cold-blooded harpy," Lucian continued, stepping into the golden pool of light. He sought to provoke a response, to find some spark of life beneath her profound resignation. "They say you watched the life fade from his eyes without a single tear. They say you welcomed the constables with a smile of triumph." At this, her gaze finally migrated to his. She looked upon him with eyes so hollow and weary they seemed to contain the sorrows of an entire age. There was no smile, no triumph, only a magnetic, crushing pull of grief that demanded he acknowledge her as a creature of flesh and blood, not merely a legal conundrum. "Will you truly ascend the scaffold in silence?" Lucian asked, his voice dropping to a desperate, pained whisper. "Do you believe that by withholding your voice, you protect what remains of your dignity? It is a fallacy, madame. Your silence is not a shield, it is a shroud." She offered him no reply, only the haunting sight of her injuries. In that oppressive gloom, Lucian realized that to save her, he must first find the woman buried beneath the victim, for she was a witness who had already departed this world in spirit, leaving only a ghost for him to defend. The iron gates of Whitmore Hall shrieked upon their hinges, a sound like a soul in torment, as Lucian forced his way into the abandoned estate. The air within the foyer was stagnant, smelling of cold ash and the peculiar, sickly scent of a house that had long played host to secrets. To the Tun, this had been a bastion of refinement. To Lucian, as he ascended the grand staircase, it felt like a gilded sepulchre. He entered the master bedchamber, the very theatre where Lord Damien had met his end. The room was a tableau of opulence, heavy brocade hangings and silver-backed brushes, yet Lucian's keen eye found a disharmony in the architecture. The depth of the room did not reconcile with the external dimensions of the wing. With a hand that remained steady despite the rising bile in his throat, he began to peel back the layers of the late lord's life. Behind a floor-to-ceiling portrait of a Whitmore ancestor, he discovered the seam. A pressure upon a hidden spring caused a section of the wainscoting to recede, revealing a narrow passage that smelled of damp copper and ancient terror. The chamber beyond was a star chamber of a most depraved design. It was a windowless vault, lined with heavy sound-dampening wool to ensure that no cry for mercy would ever reach the servants' quarters. There were no books, no comforts of a gentleman's study. Instead, The walls were adorned with instruments of correction that no Christian man should possess. Thin, silver-tipped switches, heavy manacles fixed to the stone, and leather masks designed to stifle a woman's breath. In the center of this hellish sanctuary stood a solitary wooden chair, bolted to the floor, its arms scarred by the desperate clawing of fingernails. On a small pedestal nearby lay a velvet-lined case. Lucian opened it, his breath hitching as he beheld a collection of signet rings, identical to the one Damien had worn in the Star Chamber, yet these were fashioned with inner bands of jagged, cruel steel. The ghost of Whitmore Hall was not the man who had been slain, but the monster who had lived within these walls. The violet anchor upon Evelina's throat was no longer a mystery of the night. It was the inevitable conclusion of a systematic domestic tyranny. Damien Whitmore had not been a husband, but a jailer who curated pain with a connoisseur's eye. Lucian leaned against the cold stone, a profound and righteous fury ignited in his breast. He had come seeking a motive for a crime, but he had found the anatomical proof of a war. Evelina Marlowe had not murdered a peer. She had extinguished a demon in a room the world was never intended to see. As he retreated from the darkness, Lucian knew that the law he had once held sacred was a blunt instrument, and he would have to sharpen his own resolve if he were to deliver her from the shadow of the gallows. The ride back to Ravenshire House was a grim journey through the midnight mist, Lucian's mind a maelstrom of righteous indignation. He did not seek the solace of his library. Instead, he summoned Mr. Aristhorpe, a man of profound medical learning whose knowledge of the anatomical mysteries was surpassed only by his impeccable discretion. "I require neither a sermon on the sanctity of the statutes nor a lecture on the King's peace, Doctor," Lucian stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp as he led the physician into the sepulchral dimness of the holding cell. "I require your eyes, your skill, and the unvarnished truth." Lady Evelina remained in her state of marble-like repose, a fragile spectre against the cold granite. She offered no resistance, her eyes remaining fixed upon some distant, internal horizon, as Lucian gently lowered the collar of her muslin gown. Aristhorpe leaned forward, his silver-rimmed glass catching the guttering torchlight as he beheld the violet anchor in its full, grisly clarity. The physician's hands, which had navigated 1,000 surgeries with the steadiness of an oak, trembled as he traced the perimeter of the trauma. He moved with a clinical detachment that slowly dissolved into a profound, professional horror. He examined the breadth of the finger-shaped hematomas and the jagged lacerations where the steel signet ring had sought to crush the very breath from her throat. "Observe the mechanics of this injury, Your Grace," Aristhorpe whispered, his voice thick with a sombre resonance. "These impressions were applied from a position of absolute masculine dominance. The trajectory of the force is downward and inward, designed to collapse the windpipe. This was no frantic scuffle between equals of the same station. This was a sustained, one-sided strangulation." Lucian stood with his arms folded across his chest, his countenance a mask of iron and flint. Could she have feigned these marks upon her own person to deceive the constabulary? "Impossible," Aristhorpe countered, his diagnostic tone sharpening with conviction. "The depth of the subcutaneous hemorrhaging bespeaks a physical strength far exceeding her own delicate frame. Furthermore, the span of the digits reveals the hand of a man of significant stature. See how the thumbprint rests against the carotid. These are the marks of an executioner, not a victim." Had she not found the means to strike back in that final, desperate second, she would be a tenant of the churchyard this night. The doctor looked up, his eyes meeting Lucian's with a heavy, diagnostic weight. "This is no mere evidence of a quarrel, Your Grace. This is the physical record of an assassination that failed. The murder, of which the Crown speaks, was but the instinctive gasp of a soul refusing to be extinguished." The narrative had reached its pivot. The Black Widow had vanished, replaced by the visceral reality of a survivor of a private hell. Lucian looked upon Evelina and felt the final tether of his loyalty to the old verdict snap asunder. The law demanded her head, but the evidence demanded her life. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering near her shoulder, no longer the hand of a headsman, but that of a man preparing for a holy war. The dawn was yet a distant, grey promise when the heavy iron knocker of Ravenshire House began to thunder, sounding more like a herald of doom than a visitor's greeting. Lucian had not slept. He remained in his study, the violet anchor burned into his mind's eye. The arrival of a royal messenger, draped in the king's livery and bearing a wax seal of ominous scarlet, confirmed that his defiance in the Star Chamber had reached the highest reaches of the Regency. The scroll did not contain a request for consultation, but an ultimatum. The words, pennied in a sharp, unforgiving hand, were clear. The stay of execution was viewed as a dereliction of duty bordering on treason. Should the Duke fail to deliver Lady Evelina Marlowe to the headsman by the first light of the following day, he would be stripped of his titles and find his own neck fitted for a hempen collar. The crown would tolerate no delay in the name of a black widow, regardless of the marks she bore. Lucian stood before his fireplace, the paper crinkling in his grip. The weight of the world, the weight of centuries of Ravenshire loyalty to the throne pressed upon his shoulders. To save the woman in the dungeon, he would have to sacrifice the man he had spent his life becoming. He descended once more into the cool, subterranean depths where Evelina waited. She looked up as the heavy oak door groaned open, her eyes searching his face. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the tension in his frame, and the scroll held tightly in his hand. "The king has spoken," Lucian said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones. "They demand your life by sunrise, Evelina, and they have made it known that should I fail to carry out the sentence, I shall follow you to the gallows." For the first time since the ordeal began, the quiet, humble anticipation in her eyes flickered. A shadow of genuine distress crossed her features, not for her own fate, but for the man who had dared to pause the clock of her demise. She moved to speak, her hand rising instinctively to cover the mottled bruises on her throat, but the words were caught in the wreckage of her breath. "Do not," Lucian commanded, stepping into the torchlight, his navy velvet coat a dark silhouette against the grey granite. "I have spent my years as a servant of the law, believing it to be the ultimate truth, but I have found a higher truth in this cell. I will not trade an innocent soul for my own neck. We have but one night to unmask a monster, or we shall meet the dawn together upon the scaffold." The tallow candle had burned down to a guttering nub, casting long, skeletal shadows against the granite walls of the hold. Lucian sat upon the cold floor, his noble stature cast aside, his gaze never wavering from the woman who held the power to unmake him. The king's ultimatum hung in the air like a sharpened blade, yet in the heavy silence, a different sort of tension began to fracture. Evelina drew a jagged, whistling breath, her hand rising to the violet anchor upon her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the shrill cry of a murderess, but a low, melodic rasp, like wind through dry autumn leaves. "He did not wish for a wife, your grace," she whispered, the words echoing with a haunting resonance. "He wished for a vessel for his rage. That night the wine had turned his blood to fire. He came to my chambers not with affection, but with the killing ring already fixed upon his hand. He spoke of my inheritance as though it were a prize he had already earned with my blood." Lucian remained motionless, his heart drumming a fierce, rhythmic beat against his ribs. He watched as her eyes grew dark with the memory of the struggle. "He lunged from the shadows," she continued, her frame trembling like a leaf in a gale. "His fingers were iron bands about my neck, and I felt the jagged steel of his ring bite deep into my flesh. I could not scream, I could only claw at the air as the world began to fade into a grey mist. My hand found the letter opener upon the escritoire, a mere trifle of silver and ivory. I did not think, I did only survive. I struck, not with the strength of a lady, but with the frantic, dying pulse of a creature who refused to be silenced." She looked at Lucian then, her gaze piercing the gloom with a terrifying clarity. I watched the light depart from his eyes, and in that moment I felt no triumph. I felt only the weight of a ghost that would never leave me. I did not flee, for I believed the law would see my marks and understand. I did not know the law was blind to the sufferings of a wife. The transformation within Lucian was absolute. The rigid officer of the crown, bound by oaths and statutes, perished in that flickering torchlight. In his place stood a protector, fueled by a cold, righteous fury that eclipsed his fear of the gallows. He reached out, his hand finally closing over hers, not to restrain, but to steady. "The law may be blind, Evelina," he murmured, his voice a vow of iron. "But I am its eyes this night. They may prepare the scaffold for two, but by the living God, they shall not find us easy prey. Your truth is now my armor." The morning sun pierced the stained glass of the Star Chamber, casting bloody hues of crimson and violet across the floor, where the executioner's block now sat in grim expectation. The gallery was packed to the rafters, a sweltering mass of humanity eager for the final act of the Black Widow's tragedy. Lord Chancellor Thorne sat upon his high bench, his gavel poised like a predator's claw, as the doors groaned open. Duke Lucian Ravenshire entered, yet he did not lead a prisoner to her doom. He walked as a man leading a queen into her own dominion. Evelina walked beside him, her head held high, the violet anchor upon her neck no longer concealed by a shawl, but displayed as the primary evidence of her ordeal. The hempen ropes were gone, replaced by the invisible, steel-clad protection of the Duke's presence. "Silence," the Chancellor thundered, the gavel striking with a sound of bone-deep finality. "Duke Ravenshire, you are commanded to deliver the murderess for the satisfaction of the King's law. Why does she stand before us unburdened by her chains?" "Because the only chains required in this chamber are those intended for the guilty," Lucian declared, his voice a magnificent, low roar that silenced the baying mob. He did not ascend to the witness stand. He took the center of the floor, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword. He reached into the pocket of his navy velvet coat and withdrew a small, velvet-lined box. With a flick of his wrist, he cast the contents onto the Chancellor's desk. The jagged, steel-lined signet rings of Lord Damien Whitmore clattered across the wood like teeth. "You speak of murder," Lucian continued, his eyes flashing with a cold, holy fire. "I speak of a systematic tyranny conducted under the guise of noble matrimony. I have walked the hidden passages of Whitmore Hall. I have seen the sound-dampened vault where Lord Damien curated his cruelties. I have seen the very instruments that match the lacerations upon this lady's throat." A low murmur of horror rippled through the gallery. Lucian stepped closer to the bench, his stature looming large over the magistrates. "Mr. Aristhorpe, the Crown's own man of science, has confirmed that the marks upon Lady Marlowe were not born of a scuffle, but of a calculated strangulation. She did not strike to kill a peer of the realm. She struck to survive a monster who was in the very act of extinguishing her soul." He turned then, gesturing to Evelina's bruised throat. "Behold the violet anchor. It is not the mark of a criminal, but the seal of a survivor. I stand here not to fulfill a death warrant, but to demand the exoneration of a woman who has already endured more than the law could ever inflict. If you seek a villain this day, look to the grave of Damien Whitmore, for the only crime committed was her refusal to die in silence." The Star Chamber erupted into a cacophony of dissent, the Chancellor's gavel striking repeatedly like a drum in a losing battle. "Assertion is not evidence, Your Grace," Thorne cried, his face a mask of purple indignation. "The lady's injuries, however regrettable, do not strip the late Lord Whitmore of his character, nor prove a motive for his demise." "Then perhaps the testimony of one who stood in the shadows shall suffice," Lucian countered, his voice cutting through the din. He turned toward the great oak doors and gestured with a sharp, commanding motion. "Bring forth the witness." Through the parting crowd emerged a man of advanced years, clad in the sombre, threadbare livery of a retired steward. He moved with a heavy heart and downcast eyes, clutching a small, tarnished silver box as though it were a leaden weight. "State your name for the record of the king," Lucian commanded. "Sealers Thorne, no relation to your lordship," the old man wheezed, bowing low to the bench. "I served at Whitmore Hall for 40 years, until the late lord saw fit to dismiss me without a pension for seeing that which was meant to be hidden." He placed the box upon the solicitor's table and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside lay a single, heavy signet ring, its inner band notched with the same jagged steel teeth Lucian had described. But beside it lay a folded parchment, yellowed by time and stained with the ring's dark oxidation. "This is the killing ring Lord Damien wore upon that final night," Sealers whispered, his voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed terror. "And this document, which I purloined from his private escritoire, is a draft of a letter to his creditors in the city." In his own hand, he details his intent to be rid of the Marlowe girl before the quarter-day, thereby securing her entire dowry to satisfy his gambling debts. He did not seek a wife's devotion, he sought a widow's inheritance, and he intended to procure it by his own hand. A profound, deathly hush fell over the assembly. The Chancellor reached for the parchment, his fingers shaking as he scanned the cold, calculated lines of Damien's betrayal. The evidence was no longer merely anatomical, it was financial and premeditated. The violet anchor upon Evelina's throat was now indisputably the mark of a failed assassination. Lucian stepped toward Evelina, his presence a towering bulwark of justice. The Black Widow was unmasked at last, revealing not a predator but the prey who had turned. The villain of the piece was not the woman in the dock, but the man in the tomb. In the eyes of the gathered ton, the glint of the steel ring was the final nail in the coffin of Lord Damien's reputation, and the first light of Evelina's long-delayed dawn. The gavel fell one final time, but its strike did not signal an ending. It sounded the liberation of a soul. The Lord Chancellor, his voice stripped of its former venom, pronounced the exoneration of Lady Evelina Marlowe, declaring her actions a justifiable defense against a monstrous hand. A collective breath, long-held and heavy, escaped the gallery as the Star Chamber began to clear of its grim shadows. The Black Widow had perished in the light of the truth, leaving only a woman whose dignity remained unblemished by the ordeal. Lucian led Evelina away from the dock, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back. They emerged from the oppressive stone confines of the court into the blinding clarity of a London morning. The air was crisp, scented with the promise of spring, and for the first time, the violet anchor upon her throat was kissed by the warmth of the sun. They stood upon the steps of the courthouse, the Duke's carriage waiting below. Lucian turned to her, his countenance softened by a profound and newfound reverence. From the pocket of his navy velvet coat, he withdrew a heavy ring of iron keys, the keys to Whitmore Hall and the Marlowe estates, the symbols of her independence that had very nearly been her shroud. "You were brought before me to be stripped of your life, Lady Evelina," Lucian murmured, his voice a low, resonant vow that carried only to her ears. "Instead, it is I who have been stripped of my blind adherence to a law that failed to see you. I was sent to be your executioner, yet I stand here as a witness to a fortitude I have never before encountered." He took her hand, placing the cold iron keys into her palm, and closed his gloved fingers over hers. "I do not return these to you as a guardian to a ward, but as a man acknowledging a peer. You owe no debt to the crown, nor to me. Your life is your own, bought with a courage that humbles the very title I hold." Evelina looked at the keys, then up into the eyes of the Duke. The quiet, humble anticipation that had once looked toward the gallows was gone, replaced by a radiant, steel-clad hope. She did not bow, she stood tall, a mirror to his own nobility. "You did not merely stay the blade, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady and clear in the morning air. "You gave me the voice I thought had been strangled forever." Lucian offered her his arm, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. As they descended the steps together, the Duke of Ravenshire knew that while his world of rigid statutes had crumbled, a new kingdom of mutual respect had risen in its place. The marks upon her neck had frozen him once, but the fire in her spirit had changed him forever.